I could have talked about Brexit as an application, or I could have talked about US-China trade conflict as an application. Actually, I would argue that for all its harms, US-China trade conflict is less of an actual trade war than Brexit is inflicting on itself, on the UK itself. This is 60,000 ceramics that were lost in a shipwreck about 1,200 years ago. This is an exhibit at the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. A ship that was traveling from the port in China where these were mass-produced, albeit not in mechanized industrial fashion, and it went down somewhere between Indonesia, a piece of Indonesia and Singapore, and was discovered roughly 20 years ago. There were 60,000 pieces of pottery, of ceramic, being made to order for clients in the Middle East and eventually in Europe. It's taking place during the Tang Dynasty, and it's just one ship. It's not written up in any of the annals that this was a unique devastation. Just like with the Boston whalers 1,000 years later. This was just something that happened. You sent out a bunch of ships, some of them declined. And so the scale of trade that existed before we talked about globalization, before we talked about the West, was very great. And so one of the messages I want to give you in a sense today is trade isn't what gets really messed up by these trade wars. It's actually more important things. Trade is interrupted and production moves across borders. So I've spliced together various bits from this exhibit. Suddenly there was an internal problem in China, and you had a sudden stop in production for about 130 years, and it was internal chaos. And Vietnam and Thailand, which most of us don't think of as major production centers in the year 1300, 1400, quickly stepped in to fill the Ming gap. But then it turned out China came back in and outcompeted them. Then another couple hundred years later, you have the collapse of the Ming Dynasty following a very angry back and forth internally in China about whether or not they should be exposed to foreign trade in the rest of the world. And basically, China gets out of the market for another 40 years. But the Japanese come in. They manage to displace the Chinese. And it turns out that the Chinese later have to imitate Japanese ceramics in order to compete for the market that they once owned. This is the ebb and flow of trade. And with each one of these decisions, each one of these changes, production moves. You actually have physical production, investment, the networks of shipping, the networks of people, what languages get learnt. And you have a bit of a golden era in Vietnam in this brief period that then erodes. My wife and I were just in Hoi An in Vietnam a few months ago, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And most Americans think of Hoi An as being next to the famed China Beach from the Vietnam War. For me, the economist geek, what was fascinating was it was this major trading site with Japanese and Dutch and Chinese, and then it goes away. So these kinds of trade relationships, they're very material. They leave a legacy, they move people, but they go away. It is transient. I think it's pretty clear where I'm going with this. Trade relationships are not just about the trade. I don't want to exaggerate that trade liberalization doesn't matter. It does, of course. It's about efficiency. But when we think about the macroeconomic effects, the long-term growth effects, the employment effects of trade, it's really not about this one industry in this one location rising or falling. It's really about the dynamic efficiency in a loose sense of an economy, its growth path, and how much it's able to sustain that integration with the rest of the world. There are classes of what we call macroeconomic models, and every central bank and every large international financial institution and most finance ministries have some version of these. And when I was at the Bank of England starting a decade ago, they were proudly using Beckham, the Bank of England quarterly model, which in the jargon was a DSGE model, which I referred to as junk from the day I got there. And it turned out that Beckham had a lifetime approximately half that of Beckham the soccer player for whom it was named. During the financial crisis, when we tried to figure out what was going on, one piece of the bank's research or forecasting staff was sent off to do something with Beckham. What they would bring back was useless. despite being dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium, which are, of course, motherhood and apple pie to every macroeconomic modeler, they were useless because of three things, in my view. The model was closed because it always assumed you got back to some long-run equilibrium. It always assumed that you had forward-looking agents and various constraints that would push you back onto the main path. And frankly, that is not a common state of affairs for most economies in the world. Second reason was because they embodied a certain set of ideological ideas. Every model has to have some kind of first principles, some kind of information behind it. And in my view, given when I trained in graduate school, I viewed it as the triumph of what were called then the real business cycle types, or the freshwater types, over the Keynesian types, and that they felt they had to act like the freshwater types to be macho in the economic academic world. And the third reason I found these models problematic, which other people have written about with far more power than I have, Simon Wren-Lewis is a good example, they were founded fundamentally in order to use what are called micro foundations, to have everything go down to a few representative actors, scaling up and trying to define what they did and accumulating this up. Let me give you a different historical analogy. Economics has spent the last 100 plus minus years aping physics. It wants to be physics. Both my parents were physicists, so I know what it's like to be a failed physicist who becomes an economist. But if you know something about the history of physics, there were long periods in which people engaged in observational physics and coming up with some kinds of general observations about the world. Think of Kepler or Tycho Brahe making the first observations about orbits being elliptical. Long before Newton gets to quantum, long before quantum gets it to where you are now, where physics is essentially micro foundations. It's built from the individual atomic reactions up. It took several hundred years and a lot of observational equipment to do that. Modern macroeconomics, mainstream macroeconomics, tried to do that in the span of basically 50 years, from Keynes to when I was coming out of grad school in the 80s and 90s. And this, frankly, was hubristic. Where I think we have to think about, if we're going to try to be rigorous but actually relevant in analyzing trade shocks, is to be more humble and in the spirit of Kepler. We're making general aggregate level observations, we're establishing patterns, we have some theory behind it, but we're not trying to ground everything in micro foundations and bring it up. And of course, there are those of you who will tell me that the Bank of England has a zippy new model now, and the average dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model now has different representational agents, so it's not all one rate. Yeah, fine, okay. As a practitioner, someone in the policy sphere, someone who does forecasting in part for a living, let me tell you a little bit about how macro models now work. We get to the issue of there is a trade conflict. Donald Trump is going to impose on the US, and that's the way it should be phrased, impose on the US tariffs on other countries. There's threats of escalating trade war. How should we think about what the impact will be? What will happen to growth over the next year? What will happen to unemployment? And being intellectually honest but pro-globalization, what can I fairly claim are the costs of what I know to be a really stupid policy? Any standard macroeconomic model, you'll get the result that these trade shocks are very small and transitory. They're basically a price shift, some accumulation of distortions, which are second order small, and the economy will adjust. From a central banking perspective, it will tell you that the direct inflation effects of this are small. Even if you put tariffs on everything, if the central bank in these models has anchored expectations, the holy grail of monetary policy, then it doesn't get passed through. It's just a one-time shock. You get over it. If you saw that as the U.S. put tariffs on Mexico, the Mexican peso declined, almost one for one with the tariffs. Similarly, the Chinese renminbi, until the Chinese government intervened. To say, okay, it's a little more than that, you start talking about uncertainty. And of course, this is what the Bank of England and much of the discussion you're all hearing in the press and in learned circles about Brexit is, it's uncertainty. It raises uncertainty, and whatever the outcome, things will be better. I think this approach is unsatisfactory. The first thing is that I want to make a distinction between trade wars and small trade disputes. There is no question that if the U.S. doesn't respect geographic denominations and makes Parmesan cheese by the Kraft factory in Chicago, that has a certain distortionary effect. And if Europeans in their wisdom decide they don't like chlorine-dipped chicken, that has a certain distortionary effect. That's not what we're talking about, okay? That's not the big deal. The question is, if you have a significant shift in trade liberalization, a conflictual shift, does it matter? I want to get into this issue of the uncertainty modeling. The dirty little secret of these models, of course, is garbage in, garbage out. We don't have any way to endogenously create the uncertainty. So you end up, if you're a modeler trying to do this, you end up essentially assuming what level of uncertainty gets you the size of the shock that you think is reasonable. Now, people who are honest don't want to do that. And so there are people like Bloom, Davis, who are trying, using large data, to come up through the news media and through other means to track uncertainty. This is worth doing, but it doesn't quite disentangle very well what are the drivers. When you have an unusual event like a trade shock and people are not used to talking about it, even then, if you try to put the language in, it's not going to help you very much, as opposed to, say, talking about monetary policy hike, which gets talked about once a month. The other thing is that in these uncertainty, in these models, they tend to be resolved. It tends to be, as you'll hear people saying about Brexit, okay, leave aside the normal person who says, enough of this, I just wish it was over. Think about the business person or the investor, the people you're all going to be, or some of you already are, saying, okay, I can cope, I can deal, I can move, as long as I know what the outcome is, what the rules are that I have to adjust to. And there's a certain amount of merit in that. As I'm fond of saying, the problem with Brexit isn't uncertainty about Brexit, it's Brexit. So it's partly that you're moving to a regime where there will be ongoing uncertainty, where it's not just one time, if Parliament ever were to get its act together. When we have a large shock to investment, and by here I mean real investment, it tends to understate how much of a change in productivity trend you get when there's a disruption. So the evidence is, we know that when you open up an economy and you make major changes and it becomes attractive to international investors, and that transfers some competencies, that transfers some skills and technology, that leads to a certain amount of stability and property rights, that when you do that, it tends to lock in productivity gains and put the economy on a higher productivity gain track. Again, this is a little bit idealized, but the people who attack it, the Danny Rodricks of the world, exaggerate the attacks. If you look at the story of Mexico or of South Korea, this is the story. And it's about the competition and the internal discipline that's imposed by bringing in the investment, and the investment is both a cause, a partial cause, and a marker of this. The final thing is, despite the huge advances in formal political economy done through the years in this profession, it basically doesn't come into the forecasting models at all. And trade is, in my view, very much a political economy story. All right. So let me continue to be negative. The alternative way that most economists can think about trade shocks is you actually go to a trade economist. They mostly do what are called computable general equilibrium models, CGE, as opposed to DSGE. Macro is DSGE, trade is CGE. For those of you who learn about these things, CGE models essentially are mappings of input-output tables for multiple countries into some set of structural relationships. And the beauty of these models is that you can see a lot about how relative prices and allocations of labor between different sectors occur. They are ultimately, they're full employment models. You have to assume all factors of production are fully employed. And so they're not good at addressing questions about shocks. There are dynamic CGE models, but they don't really do that. What CGE models do is really comparative scenarios. Under a certain set of prices assumptions, you get this, and under a certain set of assumptions, you get this, and then you look how it compares. So studies are generally CGE estimates, and they give you some sense of the scale of what would happen if a bunch of tariffs go up around the UK. But to me, they fundamentally underestimate all these dynamic effects. This approach is not great either. We live in a world of what are called global value chains, particularly what integrated production. Now, this is the image which was written up in the press. Two examples that are very telling. One is when they were trying to unravel NAFTA, the Trump administration was trying to unravel NAFTA, or threatening to. It was pointed out that for a car that is supposedly produced in the United States, usually the various pieces of the car would cross the border with Mexico and Canada 7 times before final assembly. A story in the Brexit context that got a lot of press that I thought was very nice, although it may say something about my consumption habits, was that Bailey's Irish Cream producers in Ireland source their milk and cream for the production of their liquor at various times of year on different sides of the Northern Ireland border, depending on what the cows feel like. This sounds a little comical, but the reality is this grew up organically. And so when it came to challenges of NAFTA, and when it came to Brexit, if I would go speak to a representative auto company or global IT company, and I would say, well, you know, we don't want any secret data, but we're trying to figure out what's going on here. Can you share with us some data and help us understand if you have to resite production, what's it going to cost? How's it going to work? And the answer to every one of these global leading companies we spoke with, which wasn't everybody, but was say 5 to 8 companies, was we actually don't really know. We sort of just made the decisions as we went, and then it would come this opportunity or that, and now we got to try to figure out how to pull it all back together. So it's very disruptive to think about unfurling these chains. To be fair to the CGE modelers, a lot of them are good trade theorists and have really worked on this. It's partly just as an aspect of what I said. It's just we don't have the data. We literally just don't have the data to understand what these chains do. But in the end, it's still the problem of you're not looking at productivity and you're not looking at political economy. So let me make a comparison to something which people in this building at DAFM, down the street at the bank, and elsewhere around the macroeconomics profession have been struggling with, which is how did we adapt macro models to financial shocks? I think all of you will remember we had a financial crisis in 2008 and on. The models and the policymakers ahead of the crisis did not see it coming. Or if they saw it coming, they did not see it coming in the form and extent and depth that it came. They did not see the persistence of it and the difficulty of getting out when it came. And I can quibble at the margins that I saw a little more or a little less of this or that, but I, of course, was one of that group. And the reaction of many of my distinguished colleagues, including people like Olivier Blanchard, is to say, well, we are going to start building financial markets into these models. And that was, to me, was one of the great ideological revelations or aspects of the DSGE models, the standard macro models that I used to comment on and hate, which was they didn't have a financial sector because everything would wash out. Financial markets were efficient, and over time, the people would figure it out, so they excluded the financial sector. So for the last 10 years, a number of very brilliant macroeconomists have worked very hard to try to attach financial sectors to the macro models we have. I'm going to leave aside for tonight and to my methodological betters whether or not that research program has paid off yet. But what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about why you can't, even if this program is entirely right, the approach that was taken to integrate financial shocks isn't going to work to integrate trade shocks. So if you look at the financial shocks, going back to what I was ranting about a few minutes ago, in the financial markets literature, you can really talk about micro foundations. You can talk about different agents having maybe different amounts of collateral or different net wealth or different liquidity positions. But in a sense, it is very intellectually appealing and tractable to build from the micro up. You've got a bunch of people who have assets, the values of the assets change. And the linkages to investment are pretty direct. It's the hurdle rate for companies goes up, the availability of capital or of cash goes down. You may not have foreseen them in 2008. I may not have foreseen them in 2008, but we can spell them out. We can talk about it. With due praise to Reinhardt and Rogoff, but many others working at places like the IMF and the various central banks, we've got lots of historical data on past financial crises. When we talk about major trade wars, it's all entirely different. It's not micro-founded. It's basically, this is the world in which countries matter, not companies, not individuals. It's where your headquarters is, where you pay your taxes, where your plant is sited. And it's imposed by the government. The impacts are about companies making decisions, making assessments. It's not that they're suddenly out of liquidity in some generic sense. They've got to rethink, reoptimize. And since the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was founded in the late 40s, they've got almost no examples of real trade war. You just have minor trade skirmishes and lots of examples of liberalization. And one thing I would take from the work on financial shocks is things are not symmetric. You could argue, well, let's just do the liberalization exercise in reverse and that'll tell us what all the bad stuff would be. That, in a sense, is what the CGE models do. But I think, as with financial markets, the reversal has effects beyond that, especially depending on the causes. Or to cite my favorite play, if any of you saw Stoppard's Arcadia, when you swirl the jam in the oatmeal, you can't unswirl it easily. Trade wars. I came up with a practical definition of this about a year and a half ago, because I was sick of people talking about not defining it. And so in comparison to a normal trade dispute, I think there are three big things that define a trade war. It's an issue that really is between countries or nation states and is not about one company whining to their local government about their treatment. So to put it very bluntly, Huawei alone is not a trade war. Boeing Airbus alone is not a trade war. Second thing is that in a trade war, you're mostly trying to take measures that are defined by the national origin, by which countries are in the dispute, what you're trying to think through, and not about a sector. The third point is that you're moving to a zero-sum state of the world, that you're actually trying to inflict enough harm on your opposing country, on your opposite number, that you're trying to change their behavior in a punitive fashion, or at least remove yourself from integration with them, rather than, as has been the case with most trade disputes for the last 70 years, just trying to keep it contained. And so you end up with a situation where the potential for escalation is more normal than it normally would be. And so you end up with something that's much bigger and more uncertain than a fight, Airbus, Boeing, chlorinated chicken, Huawei, Japanese cars in the US, whatever you want to list. And so to me, trade wars are fundamentally political shocks. They have to be generated by a government, a national government, because this is one of the defined attributes of a national government is control of tariff policy. They are usually undertaken by governments who have zero-sum ideologies, and it's usually part of a broader move towards economic nationalism. This is a historical generalization. And again, we don't have that much data. My colleagues at Peterson, Jeremy Zettelmeyer and Monica DeBola, are at the early stage of a large research project on what we're calling economic nationalism. We think that that's a more useful term than populism, which can mean any number of things. And what you find is, at least on their initial results, and it should surprise no one, that there is a high correlation between governments that are more autocratic, more xenophobic, more nationalist, and their tendency to want to disengage from the world economy or to put trade measures on perceived enemies. You can think about the import substitution, sadly, in history in Latin America. You can think about the way India felt it had to behave coming out of British colonialism. You can think about Brexit. As I said in an interview at the school across the street when I gave a talk on Brexit there about a year and a half ago, you have to see Brexit as largely an ethnic nationalist movement. Yes, you can always find somebody, you can find the lone Brexiteer who in some principled way thinks that UK sovereignty is being tromped on by Europe. But they, of course, love French and love Polish plumbers and love everybody, and it's just about the sovereignty. You can find someone. You can also find a Trump voter who votes for Trump solely because they care about getting their taxes cut and not because they're racist. But that's not the main source of the political movement. And so, consistent with what I said earlier, to me, the primary impact is on investment. And one way of seeing this is on net inward FDI. So if you think about foreign direct investment, which is the economic category for large long-term moves by multinational companies. Essentially, you build a plant, you take over a plant, you set up an R&D center, you acquire some people and human capital, you put a distribution network in a country, as opposed to speculative financial investment. This is a very small subset of what is the total flows of capital in the world sloshing around any given day. But I think it's very interesting for two reasons. First, as colleagues of mine, including Fred Bergston and Ted Moran, have written through the years, it tends to have very large beneficial spillover effects for both the sending and receiving country. The receiving country generally tends to get, it's network effects. You tend to sell more services, sell more goods, get more exchange of people, get more common understanding, there's more trust and therefore less financial self-protection, on and on and on. And particularly when it's coming from a rich country to a much poorer country, that you also get some amount of technology transfer, which, by the way, I think is good. In Washington, you sometimes have to say that. The other reason FDI is particularly interesting is that it represents long-term investment. These are companies, Royal Dutch Shell, Toyota, that are making decisions about plants, about markets, that they have to make very large upfront investments, so they have to plan over long horizons. And so the model you have in your head, loosely speaking, of the investor affected by uncertainty really applies to these people. They are very well informed, they know their business, and then something in the environment changes around them and they have to adapt. There's limitations to working with FDI data. It's very noisy. One or two large transactions can affect a huge amount of the data. But essentially, if you look at the data in the US, from the time Trump gets elected, net inward foreign direct investment in the US crashes. This isn't a China effect, by the way. Bilateral direct investment between China and US was actually flat, essentially, over this period. It will go away, but for the time being, it was flat. And if you look at the UK data, it's a little more noisy. It's a smaller country, so it's a little more affected by single transactions, but essentially the same thing is true. In 2016, you get the Brexit referendum, and what had been a huge upswing in foreign direct investment in the UK after the crisis turns into a major downswing. If we're going to think about modeling the effects of trade wars, it seems to me we have to look at, beyond the CGE models, we have to look at a few other things. We have to look at the losses of competitive discipline internally, as well as losses of markets. We have to look at investors pricing in the possible regime change, as well as just the transitional or transient uncertainty. And we are in a global economy, so you have to look at what does this do to the relative attractiveness of your country as a platform for investment, as a place for employment relative to everybody else. And all three of these effects are not generally captured in the kinds of formal models I was talking about earlier. That's not to criticize them in the sense that people are stupid. This is a question of we haven't seen these kinds of things recently, and they are occasional things, God willing. They're not regular, simple shocks. If that's the way you should think about these macro models and how to think about problems, what do we think of Brexit? What's the result of Brexit? Fundamentally, the UK is waging a trade war on itself. The simple fact remains, gravity models of trade are one of the few things that is like a physical law regularity in economics. The gravity model says you tend to trade more, all else equal, with countries that are geographically close to you and with whom you have historical ties. And this model is very robust. And it's intuitive, and it has a very simple set of estimates. It is not a DSG, CGE, or other GE model. And so in that world, the idea that anything good can come of the UK putting up either minimal or maximal impediments to trade with the countries historically and overwhelmingly it trades with, that is absurd. And so everything else you hear about Brexit, that's where it starts. This is a self-inflicted supply shock on the UK, on its competitiveness in its natural trading markets. It also fits my definition of a trade war. It's really not about any sector. It's really not about any form of regulation. It's about we want to be out from the EU. We want to be disengaged from the EU. We want to reject and push back on the EU. And so it's being waged across multiple sectors at once. It's not something you're going to be able to contain by resolving an issue on fishing or on corporate governance. It's everything. It is being driven by political division at home. Again, thank you all for coming out tonight instead of watching the Circus Maximus down the street. I mean, what is there to say? But like perhaps the Ming Dynasty, it is internal division and an ethno-nationalist ideology that is driving this. That doesn't mean, obviously, that everyone in Parliament believes that. But clearly there is enough people in Parliament and enough voters behind them that we can't make this go away. And then finally, and this is probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say, and I will just assert it, even if we end up with Norway Plus, which is code for the softest possible Brexit, in a sense the pointless Brexit, the Brexit that you give up any political say in the decisions of the EU on economics, but you try to keep everything else about the relationship. It's better than the alternatives, still pretty stupid, still pretty pointless. Even if we end up there, then I begin to worry it's not a sustainable outcome. Because ultimately, this does not address the ethno-nationalist views. This does not address the sense of conflict with the EU. And if you have people who are already feeling displaced by, be it the Remain so-called elites or by the Brussels people, then having even less voice in Brussels than you did will, of course, not solve the problem. I want to stress the big impact is on investment and productivity. It's not about what's going to happen to the farmers and the fishermen and the Greggs bakers and all the rest of it, even though some of them will hurt, and even though every average UK resident will have to pay more, will have a lower real income, whether it's a small amount lower or a big amount lower remains to be determined. And even though EU nationals living in the UK are going to have to suffer at a minimum administrative costs and uncertainty and at a maximum displacement, from an economist's perspective, a macroeconomist's perspective, the big thing is productivity. You're going to be cutting out from global supply chains, which were set up mostly to use the UK as a platform to export into the EU because you had networks and preferences for English-speaking, rule of law, comfort in the UK, and that's going away. And with the removal of those supply chains, it's not separable from the sale of business services. It's not separable entirely from the sale of financial services, both directly in the sense that these kinds of supply chains amplify those networks and because there will be political decisions made. And so the UK will not just suffer directly from the trade barriers and the fact that if you're not in the single market, which again remains to be determined, you do not have equal access to the service economy for exports. Additionally, the relationships will break down, the standards will break down, the networks will break down. And so British soft power, I'm old enough to remember Cool Britannia from Tony Blair. I was living here, we were living here for the London Olympics, and I remember crying watching the opening ceremony of the London Olympics with the beauty of the dancing NHS nurses. And that's not a joke, that's real. That's gone. Might come back. I mean, the US did somehow manage to get popular again after the Vietnam War, but it took a while. It took a lot of doing. It took Germany a long time to get popular again after World War II. This isn't World War II, Gott sei Dank. But British soft power is going to erode. My fear, which I've been saying for a couple of years now, is that the UK is going to have to try to offset this FDI absence and the removal of investment by trying to race to the bottom. Now, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition, said that a Labour Brexit would insist on a great deal of alignment with EU regulations and standards. I hope that is the case. That would be good. But it requires an act of will on the part of whoever is governing and strong oversight from the British people and Parliament, because otherwise the temptation is not to become Singapore on the Thames, but Cayman Islands on the Thames. You can get into a situation of a downward spiral. The UK suffered a very large drop in trend productivity growth during the crisis, which has not been rectified. It stands out because all the rich countries in the world, including the US, suffered a decline in trend productivity growth since the crisis, but the UK is the only one that really went down the rankings. Essentially, everybody else, the rankings all just downshifted. The UK went to the bottom of the rich countries. But again, this also applies to the US. If you're in a world where there are not easy growth coming through productivity gains, you're fighting over more of a stagnant pie. Let's say that a big chunk of it is exogenous, right? So as Robert Gordon argues, there is no next big thing technology right now the way there was with internet. And there's a prima facie case that it should be considered exogenous because everybody moved down at the same time. So it's not idiosyncratic to one country. It probably is about a technological shift across countries or a regime shift of some kind. So I worry about a further downward spiral when the blame game starts. And finally, to go back to my normal type of consideration, short-term macro policy, I think this is a regime shift. Despite the best efforts of the Bank of England and the no change in the legal regime and operations of the bank's independence, in my view, the UK is taking a large step back towards the 70s, if not towards EM status, in the sense that the credibility of macro policy is eroded. The credibility that you're not going to have political interventions in investment is eroded. We saw that when Theresa May started trying to do deals about Nissan or little kickbacks here and there. This is what Trump does. This is not good for investors. And so my fear, going back to where I started with the Chinese example, is this is, in a sense, the end of the Ming Dynasty. Not quite so dramatic, but that this is the end of a very long run of relatively centrist growth, relatively stable politics, relatively secure and insulated macro policy. One macro effect which I expect is that the Bank of England MPC is not going to be able to take for granted the anchoring of the currency, the anchoring of inflation expectations the way they have been able to since 1992. And so they're going to have to keep one eye on the currency when something happens. It's not the end of the world. Dozens of countries do this, but it is a step back for the UK. What's the result of Brexit? Unfortunately, a lot of broken crockery. Thank you very much. Anybody have a question? Thank you.
I'm an economic historian from the other side of the street. The economic historian, of course, would be able to think of lots of historical data on trade wars and trade disintegration. Now, as we go back in time, and don't go to the periphery of the world economy, but stay here, the 1930s come to mind.
Right.
If you look at the 1930s from the perspective of a gravity model, just putting in barriers to trade, a regime collapsing, in that case it's the gold standard, declines in trade that can be attributed to precisely that thing. That seem to be pretty much pretty similar to what gravity models have told us about several not so nice Brexit scenarios. I would like to have your take on that.
No, I appreciate you raising all of that. You know, I would, again, perhaps to resonate more with the British audience, but I also think quite relevantly, at least as much for Trump, is the Napoleonic continental system, where you are trying to force a bunch of countries that you have sway over, to disengage from trading with another country. And it ends up being very costly, not very sustainable. So yes, I agree with you. I, in a sense, like I said, I self-censored because going back to Smoot-Hawley in the 30s sort of becomes now just sort of, all right, you're telling me about that again. But as you rightly point out, there are a hell of a lot more instances than that. I get the one other thing I would say, which is not an excuse, just an explanation for the way I framed it. I said we don't have many examples of trade wars in the sense that when macro modelers and trade modelers were developing this, all these models were basically developed in recent decades, and we have not had that many examples in people's current lifetimes. But as with the financial crisis, we could all use with learning a little more economic history than we have. The holy grail that certain Brexiteers, let's say, have, that you could say, well, let's create a free trade agreement with China, or let's create a free trade agreement with all of our former colonies who are just begging for the chance to get back together with us. Or that was meant sarcastically, by the way, in case that was lost. You know, it seems a little difficult. And so now if I can get into more straight policy wonky, there is a movement in Washington to put Britain to the front of the queue, as it were, for a trade agreement with the US. This is, again, being driven entirely ideologically. John Bolton, who is the National Security Advisor, who I've debated on Brexit right before he joined the administration, he has an ideological, visceral hatred of Brussels that would rival that of Rees-Mogg. I have no idea why an American diplomat or pseudo-diplomat would have that feeling, but he has it. And so he wishes to have a US-UK trade deal, and there is a group of people in the Trump administration as a weapon against Europe, the hope being that this will help break up Europe. But what's fascinating, of course, as many people, including the press, have very accurately pointed out, the UK would have absolutely no bargaining leverage whatsoever with the US in a trade deal. And you will all be eating chlorinated chicken 5 times a day for the rest of your lives if you have a trade deal with the US. The US Congress never approves a trade deal that does not benefit US agriculture. And they have made this explicit. And this is why there's still a threat of US-EU trade battle, because the US Congress has said we can't have an agreement just on autos. There must be breaking down the barriers of GMOs and chlorinated chicken and all the rest. You're not going to get some nirvana whereby the US gives the UK some lovely access without asking for a bunch of things the UK doesn't want in terms of standards and regulations. What is interesting and intriguing is, of course, the UK could join CPTPP. And legally, this is fine. The Obama administration, when negotiating the TPP, and then the Abe administration and whichever prime minister of the week in Australia when carrying it through, kept it defined as, it says Pacific in it, but it's not actually a requirement you be part of it. You just have to agree to all the rules. And so the UK could join CPTPP, and that would very quickly get you preferred access to a huge number of growing markets. 2 problems. Well, 1 problem, 1 question. Problem 1 is the only way it works is basically essentially going back to the EU model. You have to accede to the TPP because it's already all decided by a group of nations, and no one's going to reopen that treaty just to get the UK in, just like it was the case with the EU. The second is the question, going back to where you started, which is, from an economics point of view, this would be a fascinating gravity model test. That if the UK leaps away from the EU, leaps into the CPTPP, and let's see in 5-10 years how much trade patterns change. That would be really interesting.
On the 19th century and early 20th century trade patterns vis-a-vis today, the whole structure of world trade was entirely different. Above all, it was essentially inter-industry trade.
Right.
So we were importing commodities predominantly, well, in very large measure, tropical commodities or cotton, which we couldn't make, and we were exporting manufactures which they didn't make. And there was next to no intra-industry trade.
Right.
The whole post-war development has been intra-industry and then
Quite
the
right.
supply chain trade. And for that, for pretty obvious reasons, proximity matters a lot. My favorite example of this, and I've used this many times, is that the EU does as much trade with the UK as it does with the US. though some of you realize the US is slightly bigger than the UK. And that must be either because the gravity model really matters, or being inside the EU trade envelope really matters. Therefore, if you don't believe gravity matters, you must believe that being in the EU matters. I want to support your basic argument, which is obviously right. Two really big points. The first is, in my perception, a lot of research on this, is big shifts in trade policy, in a trade war, as you describe it, is a big shift. It never comes in isolation. It's always part of a general and systemic policy shift.
I agree.
In either direction. So when the Chinese decided to open up the economy, they changed the whole economy.
Exactly.
Ditto the Indians when they did it. And of course, after the war, when we liberalized. And what the US is doing now is going to change ultimately, if it continues down this line, its whole economy. And the second point, to underpin your uncertainty point, it is important to note that in the GATT system, which was created after the war, the notion of binding tariff value measures is as important as liberalizing them. Mm-hmm. What was that about? It means that you commit yourself not to change the barrier. And you commit yourself internationally in a binding way. I won't go into all the details of this. This is why the US policy change is so profound. The US, by its assault on the GATT and its clearly illegal measures and its subversion of the dispute settlement principle, is about, what it's doing is demolishing the certainty aspects of the system. And that must have an enormous effect on investment worldwide in anything that is likely to end up with trading with the US. So it's a very systemic change.
Again, we're in complete agreement. I didn't do it as well as you just did, but a year ago in Foreign Affairs, I wrote about the post-American world economy, and I talked about this idea that the US corroding globalization in the system reduces the investment prospects just throughout the world economy, and I completely agree with you, Martin.
Thank you for the informative talk today. I have a quick question. It's mostly about the conflict with China and the U.S. So there's been a lot of criticism in the news, especially with President Trump currently now. How do you think would be the better way to adjust Chinese trading practices to benefit the U.S., being that the Chinese for years have been controlling and manipulating their own currency and have had bad tendencies when it comes to trading globally?
My predecessor at the Peterson Institute and another colleague, so Fred Bergson and Joe Gagnon, literally wrote the book on currency manipulation, and the legislation the U.S. Treasury has now to name governments currency manipulators is based on their work. The Chinese government was engaging in wholesale currency manipulation that was costing the U.S. some jobs and everybody else some jobs, and leading to imbalances roughly from 2002 or 3 to 2008. And the U.S. government refused to name China a currency manipulator, even though there was clear evidence, even though people like us were saying they should. Because the State Department and the diplomats kept prevailing in the interagency discussions, they kept saying, we want China to have a market-determined exchange rate. So there were two problems with this. First, you didn't call them on what they were doing. And second, no, you sure as hell do not want China to have a market-determined exchange rate, because then that would be hugely destabilizing for the world economy over some long transitional period while there were huge capital outflows from China and a lot of transformational change. The U.S. government fundamentally screwed up the currency manipulation discussion in the 2000s. But we have to keep that in perspective. That was the U.S.'s fault. The minute the U.S. got serious about currency manipulation and pursued constraints on it through the G20 process, China stopped. China's been leaning to maintain the currency from recent years, partly because of the currency outflow they experienced in 2015. But they haven't been manipulating, nor has Japan, since we got an international agreement. I don't view Chinese commercial behavior as really a problem. We have to remember that there has never really been any successful defense of intellectual property that matters. Tea was the genetically modified organism of its day. It was the most valuable product. It was only grown in certain places in China. And an enterprising English diplomat managed to figure out, hey, maybe it'll grow in India instead, steal some seeds under threat of death, and suddenly there's competition for tea from China. Even if you look at the atomic bomb, or the H-bomb, most important secrets we could have in a technological sense, they were both in the Soviet Union's hands roughly 3 years after we started. What I care about is genuine competitive advantage. It's that you're genuinely better at putting together airframes. You're genuinely better at creating business services. You're genuinely better at running a business and getting your people in the business to behave in certain ways and provide certain skills. That's where most of the comparative advantage from the rich countries is in the world today. It's not tech transfer. I view this as something that the U.S. can stand up for. As a matter of forecasting, Washington has gone crazy over this. Democrats are just as crazy as Republicans on this. The defense establishment's crazy over this. But we're not being hacked because China stole some technology. We're being hacked because of Facebook and because of North Korea, which sure as hell doesn't have any technology. So to me, the commercial relationship and the angst over it is fundamentally misguided. This is an extremely unpopular and unusual opinion in Washington right now, just for the record. Yes?
I am a third-year undergraduate student here at King's Business School. Relating to Brexit, there must be some kind of advantage that we are expecting, right? Because at the time when Brexit was announced, I'm French, and there was quite a bit of talk in France about France leaving the European Union and kind of doing our own thing. And if you do read some of the literature about the EU as it is right now, a lot of people criticize the fact that it's lasted so long because it was basically a system after the Second World War to kind of bring Europe back. And it's just lasted too long. There are a lot of restrictions, as we know. So is it possible that this is just kind of the beginning of a domino effect where we dismantle the EU and then we have the opportunity to get more favorable deals with every single component, every single country inside of Europe, rather than having one blanket kind of relationship that they'll have with bigger blocs?
Right. To be honest, I think your first point's about whether there's something to be gained about extricating from Europe and the future of Europe is a deep point and merits discussion in a real way. The idea about the individual deals, however, is something that frankly doesn't really hold up, because there is an enormous efficiency gain for businesses in terms of certainty and in terms of standardization and economies of scale when countries are able to negotiate, if not multilateral, plurilateral, or regional deals. This is something on which, as Trump has found out by his attempt to negotiate everything bilaterally, even if you're a bully, it usually doesn't work. It's much more efficient. So we went through NAFTA 1.0 and turned it into NAFTA 0.8, all in order to basically make the auto industry less competitive and otherwise add some things to NAFTA that are already in the TPP. So the idea that it's useful to have a deal within any individual country actually doesn't really hold up. Thinking about Europe, and particularly the Euro area, it has overreached. Maybe it's gotten too integrated, too aggressive in what it does in Brussels, and particularly the Euro area enforcing Euro membership on a large number of members, though not the UK, just sets you up for a fall, because these much less lower per capita income countries have not synchronized their economies with Germany. Europe has been unable to agree to do the fiscal policy transfers or other adjustments that would be necessary to make the euro fit for purpose to ride out the next recession. And so then you can argue, well, we really will be better off outside. And if you're Greek, you are not able to adjust your monetary policy when something hits your country. So there are a lot of reasons why I talk about Europe. Another set of reasons, which is beloved of people, certain groups of people, which has a certain amount of merit, but I think is exaggerated, is that Brussels is this horrible regulatory nightmare, and we will all get much more efficient if we get out from under that. I think in practice, again, there's lots of documentation on this, that gets exaggerated, and a lot of what our inefficient regulations have to do with UK-specific regulations or UK application of Brussels regulations. There are arguments to be made. It's not clear, since the UK had a series of opt-outs on various things, how much the UK was disadvantaged as much as some others if you accept these arguments. Most of the people who are arguing against Europe are arguing from a place of nationalism, are playing off refugee issues and internal movement of people who don't necessarily look like them or act like them. And I am willing to stand up and say that the European Union's ideals, frankly, are better than that. And the kind of nationalism we see in France under Le Pen or Hungary under Orban or under the people in the Liga in Italy is wrong. And I know you're not advocating that, I'm not saying that, but this is ultimately what Europe, the European movement was about, was damping down that nationalism because it's not good. And the fact that people like it, some people like it, doesn't make it good. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.